So the first one, if you're doing an assessment, know what you want to measure. Sounds obvious, but really think about the meaning of what you're measuring and why you're measuring it and what you're going to do as a result of that to make sure you get the right thing. The next thing is to make an evidence-based approach. So it's what psychologists do. It's our approach to working with people and behavior. Just thinking, what do we know? What is the evidence for what I'm doing, for the intervention that I want to do, for how I'm doing measurement? So for instance, there are studies that show incredibly strongly that if you train the people that are doing the assessment, they do it better. It's not rocket science, but it's a very big effect. There are some other studies which are surprising. For instance, at the end of your assessment center, if you usually have a discussion to decide what you think about the different people, to compare views, to come to a conclusion, it turns out that that gives you much less helpful results than if you just average all the scores of the different assessors. That is much more effective, for instance, at selecting the most appropriate people to do in a role. And the last thing I wanted to say was that if you have invested in doing some assessment and you are finding out about people, it's really useful to actually use that information to follow up on it. So not just for making the selection decision, but for maybe passing that information on to the manager so that they can know where the person's strengths are, what they might need more help with, what development they might need. If you're doing assessment for development, it's not just about giving people some development pointers, but really following that through. If you're doing it for the organization, then it's not just knowing what the problem is, but are you going to do something about that? And are you going to check whether that has happened and whether it's really addressed the input? I think there's a lot of ways that assessment passes in because, for instance, when you assess people, you're giving them a message. You're telling them what you think is important in the sense of what you're measuring. You're telling them something about yourself when you assess them. So a well-designed assessment process, you will explain to the person why you're going to assess them, how you're going to assess them, what they need to know about that, what's going to happen with it. And if the person is engaged in the process because they know what's happening, they're much more likely to cooperate with and give you better information. They're also telling you, you're telling them something about the organization and they will respond to that. For instance, again, if I'm thinking about selection, there's research that shows that depending on the experience of an individual in the recruitment process, they will think differently about your organization. And whether you employ them or not, they may still be your customer, they may know other people that might want to work for you, and if the process of the assessment and the communication around it is not a positive process, that will have a negative impact. And the opposite is true. If it's positive, even if you don't select them, they might say, you know what, they assess me very well, they're a good company.